All right. Well, good morning, everyone. It is so good to be together with you today on this Father's Day weekend. Really glad to be here. My name is Kent. I'm one of the pastors here. Excited to be with you and to be continuing our series in Genesis. We're actually nearing the last couple weeks in this series, and so I hope you've taken something out of it thus far. I know it's spoken to me in lots of different ways. But if you've been here, you know that Genesis is essentially a gospel origin story. Right? Beyond the debates about the creation and the flood and all the other details we like to get hung up on, is really a simple narrative about a God who doesn't give up on us. In spite of our failures, in spite of our brokenness and our sin, we've seen God working in the midst of it all to make things right once and for all. And week after week, we've been looking at these different examples throughout the book of Genesis of how this is true. But if we're honest, it's taken a little bit of work for us to make that clear, right? Because as we've been saying week after week, that unlike the stories that we watch on TV that make us feel really good, Genesis feels different, right? Genesis can often leave us feeling unsettled. We often leave our readings of Genesis asking questions like, why, God? Why would you write your story like this? And as we've been saying, the reason for that is because it's a true story. That Genesis doesn't feel like a movie because it isn't really trying to. It's trying to deal with reality. And real problems are real complicated. Your problems, my problems, they're complicated. They require complicated solutions. And that is what we see happening in Genesis. That God's thoughts aren't our thoughts, His ways aren't our ways, and it's really good news because we need something beyond just our ways, all right? And so today we're just continuing this series, and our big and central idea is just that God is working in ways that go beyond us. All right, ways that we would never imagine. He's writing a script for your life that you'd probably never consider. And my hope is that if you came in here worried about your situation or worried about someone else in your life, my hope is that you could consider the possibility that God might be working in ways that are beyond what you might have imagined. That even if you don't understand why things are happening the way that they are in your life, that we can still find hope and rest when we trust that God is doing something good beyond us. So that's where we're going today. I know it sounds familiar as what we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks, but I think that's good, right? We need reminded of these things over and over again because if you're like me, you forget. And so that is what we're doing today. If you have a Bible, you can take it out right now and open up to Genesis 37. If you want to follow along, feel free to. We're pretty much going to read that whole chapter. I'm going to show us a few ways that God is working beyond us throughout this story, and it's going to be good. We're coming to the final character in the book of Genesis. We've talked about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all these different characters. Today, we come to Joseph. All right, you may have heard of Joseph before. If you haven't, that's totally fine. But his story is interesting for a number of reasons. And one of them is just that it's really long. All right, it occupies almost a fourth of the entire book of Genesis. And so we're actually going to take the next 2 weeks to camp out on Joseph, 2 weeks to give a bird's eye view of this guy's life. And so full disclosure, today's going to end on a cliffhanger. All right, this is just going to be an introduction. I'm going to tee things up, and then next week, Matthew McClure is going to come in, and he's going to give us part 2 of Joseph, all right? And so that's going to be great. But for now, let's dive in with part 1, Genesis 37, starting in verse 2, if you're following along. It says, "This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the son of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him." Okay, So this is pretty par for the course for what we've been reading in Genesis thus far, right? It's an unhealthy family dynamic. Jacob here, also called Israel, has 12 sons to a whole bunch of different wives. Not all of his different wives are listed here, just the ones with the best names. But they're all together and they're working, which already creates this sort of competitive environment. But on top of it all, Jacob chooses Joseph as the obvious favorite over everyone else. It's just such an unhealthy situation. Now, quick sidebar, another thing we've been pointing out each week is that just because the Bible records unhealthy situations doesn't mean that it condones them, right? And we need to remember this because when Bible critics come along, that they love to point to this kind of thing and say, see, this is why you shouldn't read the Bible. Right? It's regressive. It's right here. It's condoning polygamy. It's condoning favoritism. But the truth could not be more different. Right? The truth is that the Bible actually condemns these things directly in other places, and when they show up in narrative settings like this, they always demonstrate how they will actually ruin our lives. And that's what's going on here. This unhealthy dynamic is ruining things in this family. Joseph's brothers hate him. It says they can't speak a kind word to him, and so it's super unhealthy. So back to the point. We see Joseph. He's the favorite. That's not good. All right, and he's given this ornate robe, or this robe of many colors. You probably called it in your Sunday school class. And this is significant because it was different than everyone else's robe. Okay, everyone else's robes would have been really highly functional. They were bland-looking, short-sleeved. They stopped at about the knee so that people could bend down and just get elbows deep doing dirty work, okay? Joseph's robe was different. His robe would have been long all the way to the ground, probably. It would have been really colorful. It certainly wasn't made to do work in. And so Joseph doesn't do work in it, right? We see him here essentially with his brothers, watching them do the work, and he's giving bad reports about them back to his dad, and his brothers hate him for this. And I think if we're honest, we would probably hate him for this as well. Now, let's be real. We all probably know somebody who gets on our nerves like this, whether it's a boss, right, or whether it's a coworker or a family member, whoever it might be. We can all probably think of someone who just loves to point out our mistakes. Even though you might be the one that's working hard, you might be doing your best, and they're standing off to the side. None of that matters to them. It seems like they want to stand off behind you, like with a clipboard and a red pen, just like waiting for you to make a mistake. Now, as you're thinking of that person in your mind right now, isn't it true that if you had to pick someone to receive a special blessing from God, or pick somebody to like play an awesome role in God's story, isn't it true that you probably wouldn't pick that person? Right? And yet it's interesting here, we see that that's exactly what God does. That God works differently than we do. He works beyond us. He sometimes chooses people that we'd like to reject. God sometimes chooses people that we'd like to reject and write off and get rid of. Those are the ones apparently that get a fourth of the book of Genesis written about them. Now, yes, spoiler alert, like Joseph is picked here and he's going to get humbled, all right? And so we know that. It's not like God's choosing him was unjust or anything like that. But I wanted to point it out just right out the gate because I think in our world today, it's becoming easier and easier for us to just write off the people that we don't like, right? To disassociate when we disagree with somebody. And while I know there's extreme cases, while that's really good, and I want to be sensitive to that because we need to do that sometimes, I think we have to be really careful and discerning because the people we write out of our stories can sometimes be the very ones that God is beginning to write in to his. That's what's going on here with Joseph. God's beginning something significant in his life, something beyond what he ever would have imagined, and something certainly that's beyond what his brothers imagined for him. And so let's see what that looks like. Verse 5. It says, Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the fields when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of this dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and again he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept this matter in mind. Now here things are really like heating up, right? Joseph here probably knows that he's not on good terms with his brothers because they're not really saying nice things to him. And so there's tension in these relationships. And yet, when he receives this dream from God, this vision for what God would do in his future, he shares it in such a way that things go from bad to worse. Right? He shares this dream in a way that puts himself up high and everyone else down low. But that is not the heart of the dream that he receives, is it? Right? If you've read this before, you know that this vision is really all about God's provision, right? That the sheaves of grain are signifying how God would use Joseph to provide for his family food in this time of famine. But that's not what stands out to everyone, right? Whether it's something to do with Joseph's pride and the way that he's sharing it, or whether it's just got to do with their jealousy, that's not what sticks out. To them, the main part is all about who's bowing to who. Who's got the power? Who's in control? They miss the main point, that God is the hero of the story, leading his people to another place to care for them. And I think this is so key for us to see, because as Christians, as people who believe that we've received a vision from God for our lives, it can be so easy for us to do the same thing, for us to make ourselves the hero, to receive God's message and to somehow make it all about us. And I'll give you an example. I was watching this documentary of a megachurch recently, and there was a lot of takeaways, but one of them was that the church was totally self-centered. All right, and I didn't agree completely with the way this documentary handled things, but as I watched it, at a certain point, I couldn't help but be sad about the parts of this thing that were true. That this church had wandered and drifted from the way of Jesus in some really significant ways. Because Jesus' dream and vision for his life, right? You remember he said this, that he came not to be served, but to serve and to lay down his life as a ransom for many. And yet somehow, somewhere along the way, this church's dream and vision for their church life became all about them, all about their own success, their own numbers, and their own fame. And as I was watching this, I was like, man, I don't think this is just a megachurch problem at all. I think all of us can be tempted to do this sort of thing, where God gives us a dream, maybe not a literal one, but a vision for what he wants you to do in the world. Maybe it's just a sense in your gut for how he wants you to go out and serve. And somewhere along the way, we're tempted to just make it about us, to make it about how popular we become, how many followers we gain, how we look, what do we get out of this ministry thing, out of being selfless or whatever. And Joseph's story reminds us that God's vision is bigger than all that his dream is for his glory and not ours. And while we're invited to play a key role in it, we're certainly not the main character. See, God writes us into his story. We don't write him into ours. That's the second thing I want you to see. God writes us into his story. He's the writer that's beyond us. And in our me-centered world, we desperately need reminded of this, or things will just get worse and worse and worse between the church and the rest of the world. Right? And that's what happens here. Check it out. Back to the text. Verse 12 now. It says, "Now his brothers had gone to graze their flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, 'As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them.' 'Very well,' he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring back word to me." So he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they're grazing their flocks?" "They've moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard him say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." Wow. Escalates pretty quick, right? I mean, the brothers are super harsh. They go from just not being able to say anything nice about Joseph to all of a sudden plotting a plan for how they'll kill him and then how they're going to cover it up later on. How did it come to this? Like, what happened? And really, there's no explaining it. There's no justifying it. But I just want to draw it out and say, I think this is an example of what can happen when we allow jealousy and resentment to build. We end up making assumptions that lead to some really big mistakes, right? You see, we already know that to his brothers, Joseph was the morality police, right? Joseph had been pointing out their wrongs since the beginning, but here things really hit the fan because in this situation, the brothers are not grazing their flocks where they had said they were going to, right? And it says their dad thought they were going to be grazing in Shechem, and so he sends Joseph over just to check on them. Right, Shechem was a really dangerous place. In Genesis 34, it says that their sister had actually been abused there. And not only that, Joseph's brothers, Simeon and Levi, retaliate and kill a whole bunch of people in that area. So it's a dangerous area to go to. And so the brothers, you should read Genesis 34, by the way, if you get a chance. It's pretty epic. Anyway, the brothers probably had a good reason to move on from that area. Right? Maybe they should have avoided it altogether. But now here comes Joseph. He's got his fancy coat on. He's coming to check on his brothers to see if they're okay. And I have to imagine that in that moment, they start to think like, oh boy, here comes our supervisor. Here comes this future ruler, right? Surely he's going to point out the things that we're doing wrong. He's going to tell us, man, you shouldn't be in Dothan. You should be over in Shechem. And they're just getting angry and jealous. And this becomes a full-on plan of attack. And it's escalating and it's escalating. But thankfully, something happens. And here's what it is, verse 21. It says, when Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe that he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. And as they sat down to eat their meal, I just think it's crazy that this could be going on. They could just pause and eat a meal. When that's happening, they look up and they see a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah then said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay a hand on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and then sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. Now, this is probably the lowest point of the story, maybe the lowest point of Joseph's life. He's completely mistreated by his brothers. He's pushed into a well, an empty well, and then he's sold into slavery. I mean, he's attacked. And yet one of the things that stands out to me most in this section is just how much worse it could have been for Joseph. That initially they wanted to kill him right then and there on the spot, and they wanted to throw his body into the cistern. But thankfully, in the midst of their discussion, about how they were going to kill him, two of the brothers, Reuben and Judah, have sort of a change in conscience. Now, full disclosure, they still do a terrible thing here, okay? It's still awful. And actually, their motives aren't entirely pure either. Later on, we learn that Reuben is actually just trying to get on dad's good side, and Judah is just trying to make some money out of this whole thing. So they're still totally selfish. But at least they speak out. At least they did something to prevent the worst from happening. And I just want us to see that, because I think sometimes in life we get so paralyzed by fear, right? So paralyzed by thinking, well, if I speak out to protect this person, or if I speak out to challenge this person in what they're doing, what might happen? And as a result, we end up not doing anything at all. But I think if we see anything from this section, it's that saying something can be better than saying nothing at all. Even if your motives aren't pure, even if you say the wrong thing in the wrong way to challenge somebody, God can still use that. He's still at work beyond us, writing his story, even with our broken, messed up pieces. God works his good plan, even if ours is flawed. God works his good plan, even if our plan is flawed. And that's what's starting to happen here for Joseph. God is working out a good plan. And you might be thinking, how can this be good? How can it be good? This guy is about to become a slave. He was thinking everyone was going to be bowing to him, and now he is about to be bowing to the king in Egypt. How can that be good? And at this point in the story, we don't have the answers to that question. And maybe that's how you feel right now at this point in your life. The things that are happening to you, you're like, how can these be good? And you don't have the answers to that question. I want to wrap up with this final section, verse 29. It says, when Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. And he went back to his brothers and said, the boy isn't here. Where can I turn now? See, it's all about him. Where can I turn now? Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, we found this. Examine it. See whether it's your son's robe. He recognized it and said, it is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. No, he said, I will continue to mourn for my son until I go down to the grave. So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. So we end on a sad note here, but there's a glimmer of hope. And the hope comes from that final verse, right? It's a simple phrase that shows us that Joseph's story is still being written, that there is more that is still yet to come. And here's the thing I want you to hear. Your story is still being written. If you're here today and you're still alive, there is still more to your story. And we could end like Jacob here, who refused to be comforted, refused to listen to anyone, and just leave with our heads hung low, but there's another option as well. And the other option is to allow God to draw near to us in our hard situation. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to be mad even about what's going on, but we can also allow the Spirit of God to comfort us right where we are and to remind us that he is with us and that he understands hurt and he understands pain. See, even at Joseph's lowest point here, we're reminded of our suffering Savior, Jesus. That just like Joseph was rejected by the ones that he was sent to, Jesus was rejected by the ones that he was sent to. Just like Joseph is sent or is sold for a bunch of silver coins, Jesus is sold for a bunch of silver coins. And as he hung on the cross, the people who watched thought that all was lost. But we know that that's not the end of the story, right? That on the other side of the cross is the empty tomb, and there's something else on the other side here for Joseph. And so what about you? When you think about your story right now, would you dare to believe that there's still more yet to come? Even if you're in a valley today, I believe that we can find hope and peace when we trust that God is working in ways that are beyond us. Will you believe that this morning? And then when we come back next week, we'll explain how this story all turns out for good. But for now, let me pray, and we'll spend some time worshiping.